going back, when we talked last time, we were really setting a case of why knowledge is filtered, and that there is a larger kind of agenda that really feeds into a materialistic view of life, which leads to ultimately consumerism, which has its devastating consequences if we overconsume, which of course we are doing, right? I mean, I'm just trying to put it in a nutshell.
Sure.
And so when we talked about your early past, you were of a mind that you wanted to find the evidence. If you were reading these ancient Vedic texts that were talking about this extreme antiquity, your hypothesis is there has to be evidence for it. And so you set out to find it, and you did. And so in this conversation, I'd really like to talk about the time in which some of these discoveries were made. This whole period of the early 20th century, I mean, it was an explosion of experimentation and discovery of all kinds that seemed to shut down by mid-20th century. Late 19th, early 20th century, all kinds of things were being discovered on a spiritual level and on a material level.
Yeah, you're right about that. A lot of the archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity was being publicly reported by scientists in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And also, when we look at alternative explanations for human origins that involve some kind of spiritual element, we see that a lot of prominent scientists were conducting research into the paranormal and things like that. And I think there were a couple of reasons why that kind of research stopped being publicly reported by prominent scientists. And one reason is that in terms of the archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, before that time, they really didn't have their timeline totally fixed. Mm-hmm. As a result of some discoveries that were made in the late 19th century, they fixed their timeline so that they would have humans like us appearing less than a couple 100,000 years ago. And then because they had fixed their timeline in that way, then they dismissed all these earlier discoveries that had shown human beings were existing for far longer periods of time, going back many millions of years even. Because they were saying, well, if humans like us appeared less than 200,000 years ago, then these other discoveries couldn't possibly be true. So let's forget about them. And they were forgotten. And in terms of the alternative explanations of human origins that involve what we might call paranormal elements, there were scientists who were investigating these things, but they also stopped publicly reporting these things in the early 20th century. And I think there are some reasons for this. And one reason was that governments and corporations started putting huge amounts of money into science around the time of World War I. And they wanted results from their investment in science. They wanted very specific things. They wanted weapons, they wanted pharmaceuticals, they wanted consumer products. And scientists decided, well, if we want all this money, billions of dollars that corporations and governments are prepared to give us, we should kind of limit our scientific activity to things that further those particular goals. And therefore they decided, well, all this paranormal research and things of that isn't really contributing to that. So let's focus on the strictly material things. And in a sense, that was productive because they did get a lot of influence because of the huge investments that government and corporations made in science that would give weapons, that would give pharmaceuticals, that would give consumer products. But there was a cost to that. And I think we're still suffering the effects of that bargain that was made at that time, because what we wind up with is an incomplete picture of reality that leaves out, the spiritual element. And I think
everything non-physical, right?
Yeah, because of that, I think we've got an environmental crisis, we've got a financial crisis, and we've got a political crisis in the world. Intensifying levels of conflict that just don't seem to go away, no matter how hard we try.
And then when it's not only that it seems like it was convenient to be able to develop these industries and such, but something more aggressive happened. It seems that anything that wasn't able to be borne out in a materialistic realm of science actually was subject to ridicule from that point forward as well. I mean, it wasn't just that we need to focus on this for a while. There was almost a direct attempt to kill the other types of research and science, where it just sort of disappeared for decades, as a matter of fact, till some of the scientists of the more modern era from the 70s forward started really researching into it again, at universities even.
Yeah, and not only did they ridicule people at the time, but they rewrote the whole history of science. For example, if you look in any physics textbook today, you'll see descriptions of the work of Pierre and Marie Curie, who were husband and wife. They both got Nobel Prizes for their work in discovering radium and doing a lot of the early research in radioactivity. And you'll read about that in the textbooks, but what you won't read about is the years of research they did with psychics, people with paranormal powers.
I mean, that's real science, where you're willing to look into all realms. It's not just exclusive to one or the other. And they did this for quite a long time, didn't they?
Yes, they did 2 years of research with a medium, an Italian lady named Eusapia Palladino. And this woman had some psychokinetic abilities, mind over matter abilities that they wanted to test. And they thought these ideas were relevant to physics. And they were part of a group of 20 prominent European scientists who were conducting these experiments with this medium in Paris early in the 20th century. And they got tremendous results. On one occasion, they were sitting with a medium in the laboratory of the Psychology Institute in Paris in broad daylight. And the medium was sitting in a chair. Marie Curie was holding her hands. Other scientists were holding her feet, making sure she wasn't moving at all. And in the middle of the lab, under what he described as perfect conditions of observation, Pierre Curie said a large table like this one was floating about 3 feet off the ground. And he was measuring how high it was floating, timing how long it was floating. And after 2 years of such results, the entire group of scientists signed documents saying these things are absolutely true. Pierre Curie wrote to some of his prominent physicist friends and said, we have to take these things into account if we're going to have a complete picture of reality. But this sort of thing is absent from the current textbooks of physics. You only find the work they did with radium.
Right.
And therefore, people today get an incomplete picture of what real science actually is. You know, when they hear something like mediums, psychokinetic abilities, they would say, this is outside the bounds of real science.
But they were using scientific techniques.
They were.
And protocols to prove these things out now 100 years ago.
Yes, they were. And I think that is real science, a science that takes into account everything that's possibly true about the world that we live in. And you know, a few years ago, I was giving a lecture at a university in Europe, in the country of Hungary. It was their main science university. And I was speaking to a group of physicists and graduate students of physics. And I was going through what I call the hidden history of physics, the accounts of great physicists like the Curies, who had who had done research in these fields that are now considered outside the bounds of real physics or science. And I was wondering, what they were going to say. So afterwards, one of the physicists came up to me and said, I'm glad that you gave this talk. By day, I'm doing plasma physics, the physics of superheated gases. But he told me, privately, at night, I'm doing some experiments in telepathy. He told me, I have a son, and he's young, and I put him in another room, and then I flip a coin, and he's got to tell me whether it's heads
I used to do that with my son. Tails.
Or tails.
Yeah.
And he said, my son is getting 80% correct, which is really
Kids
unexpected.
are good,
And he said, I wouldn't tell this to any of my colleagues because they'd think I've gone off the reservation. But he felt safe in speaking to me about it. So this is something I often encounter, that sometimes there are scientists who, by day, appear completely orthodox, but privately they have other opinions.
Well, it makes sense. If they have an inquiring mind, why wouldn't they want to know a larger picture, really?
Sure.
I mean, this dates back to Sir Isaac Newton. I mean, most people think of him as sort of the godfather of the materialist view of science. However, that wasn't his sole interest at all, was it?
No, he actually spent quite a bit of time researching things like alchemy and other paranormal topics, and he wrote extensively about them. This is rarely mentioned in physics textbooks. There are some historians of science who have looked into this, but in terms of scientific discussion today, they ignore these aspects of his work.
For how long?
Which I think is unfortunate.
It is. How long have they been filtering that part of his works out?
I would say the past, well, of course, he was living during the 18th century.
Right.
So it's something that started in earnest, I believe, in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Again, we keep going back to the same period. Massive amounts of discoveries just prior to that, and then a seeming quashing of the evidence after that, following that, which is interesting. And I know we did talk about that in the last show. And what I would like to do also, there were a couple others. If you could get to Sir Oliver Lodge.
Sir Oliver Lodge was a prominent British physicist who lived in the early 20th century. And he had a son named Raymond, and his son Raymond died during World War I. He was in the British military. He was killed in Europe. So after that, Lodge tried to establish contact with the spirit of his son, and he made use of a medium. And he went in disguise and he didn't let the medium know who he was. And through the interactions with this medium, he got communications from a conscious entity that revealed things that would only have been known to his son. Very intimate details about the family history and his personal dealings with his son. So what I find interesting is that Lodge published a book about this whole case. And in it, he dealt with a lot of the types of skeptical objections that might be made by some of his scientific colleagues. So I think it's a really good example of a prominent physicist who came to accept that consciousness can survive the death of the physical body.
Yes.
And this is something I'm absolutely convinced of, that
Yes.
this body is a vehicle for a conscious self that has a non-material source. Now, this idea is not very popular in the world of science today. The most common idea today in the world of science is that consciousness is produced by the interaction of chemicals within the brain. You know, most cognitive or neuroscientists would say if you organize the molecules in the brain in a sufficiently complex way, they'll generate consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with
the firings of the brain.
with the firings
Right.
of the brain, which means ultimately there is no conscious self that could survive the demise of the physical body.
And this is interesting because it brings us into the subject of this dual nature of ourselves, which you're saying in your work is absolutely essential to being able to piece together. Utilizing the non-physical aspect of our intelligence is essential in piecing together our ancient history. You can't do it just looking for bones alone. That's not sufficient.
Absolutely. Now, what the stones and bones show us, if we actually look at all of the evidence,
Right.
is that humans have been here since the very beginning of life on Earth. You know, when people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they noticed that.
Yes.
And now what that means is we need new explanations for human origins. So people would ask me that question. Okay, what is your explanation of how we came about? And to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution. And what I proposed there was, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now, as I was just saying today, most scientists would say, we're just machines made of matter. And as far as mind and consciousness are concerned, well, if you organize matter in a very complex way in the brain will produce mind and consciousness. So it's a very materialistic conception of who we are.
Yes.
But what I'm proposing is that we're made of three things. Matter, the ordinary chemical elements, that's part of what we are. But beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers like remote viewing and
which everyone is capable of.
Yes, and we could talk about that.
Yes, well, yes.
And beyond that subtle mind element, there is a conscious self, which is totally non-material. Now, when I'm speaking about mind and consciousness, I don't mean temporary byproducts of brain chemistry. I mean real things with their own independent existence.
Subtle bodies.
Right. So if we're going to explain where we came from, we have to explain, well, where does that consciousness come from? Where does the matter come from? How do they all come together in the human form as we experience it on this earth? So what I'm proposing is that originally we're beings of pure consciousness. That's what we are. We originally exist in harmony with all other beings of pure consciousness and the source of all conscious beings. But if a conscious self leaves that original state, then it becomes associated with matter. It comes down into lower levels of reality. And why is that? Well, it's because that original level of pure consciousness is based on love, unselfish love. If a conscious self becomes exploitative or selfish, it can no longer exist in that harmony. It needs a field of activities where it can act out its desires to control, dominate, and exploit matter and others.
In these denser physical frequencies or realities.
Yes, absolutely. And for that purpose, it needs a vehicle. And there are different kinds of vehicles. There are human vehicles, there are plant vehicles, there are animal vehicles. According to the state of consciousness, it is placed in a certain vehicle. And where do those vehicles come from? Well, it comes from higher intelligences in the cosmos.
And it's worth bringing up at this point, I think, the point, because it struck me in your book, that the co-founder of the theory of evolution with Darwin, I mean the way it was ultimately played out politically, Wallace, actually came to believe there is an evolution of sorts, but it's guided by a higher intelligence, which has come to be, as we were saying off camera, kind of a fusion between science and religion so that it can live peacefully together at this point in time.
Yes, I think Wallace was an excellent example of that. He was able to integrate his spirituality and his science, and the result is a complete and better, a more complete and better science.
And right now they're still looking, they're saying, well, show me the physical evidence. So along that line, we have a few little pieces that we can talk about. I just took a few excerpts from your book just to drive home the point that these bones exist. This isn't theory. One of them I found intriguing because it's not far from where I live actually, is in the California Gold Rush territory, Table Mountain. That particular discovery. If you could talk about that a bit, because that's quite old.
That is a really fascinating case. As I say, my work starts with the stones and bones, but from there it goes on to other things. But an important first step in getting there, from the scientific point of view, is showing there is evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. Now, in the mid-19th century, gold was discovered in California, and to get the gold, miners came to places like Table Mountain, which is near Sonora in Tuolumne County in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And they were digging tunnels into the sides of that mountain to get the gold. And deep inside the tunnels, in the solid rock, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. They found stone mortars and pestles. They found obsidian spear points. They found human bones and teeth. These objects were collected by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. Mount Whitney is named after him. He was a very prominent scientist. And he reported these discoveries to the scientific world. Now, what makes them really significant is they're found in layers of solid rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. which is really quite extraordinary because the dominant idea today is that humans like us came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. So to have this evidence showing that humans like us were present 50 million years ago is really quite astonishing.
They're still looking for Native American Indian arrowheads as evidence of our antiquity from a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. And this discovery, as announced by Dr. Whitney, created some controversy. And the scientific community basically rejected the discoveries. And it's interesting why they rejected it. There was an anthropologist named William Holmes who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And he wrote in one of his reports, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have come to those conclusions. And in other words, if the facts didn't support the theory of evolution with its ideas of a recent origin for the human species, he shouldn't have published that report. He should have known these things could not possibly be true. Now, many people think that the way scientists should operate is that if facts are discovered that contradict a theory, the theory should be modified to accommodate the facts. But that's not the way that it always works. And in this case, it most certainly wasn't. So, according to Holmes, these discoveries should not have been reported.
Right.
They should have simply been forgotten. And basically, that's what happened. Now, Whitney, he published this report. It was published by Harvard University in the year 1880, but we don't read about these things in the textbooks today because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. Now, some of those artifacts are still in the collection of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. And I've been there, I've seen them, but the average person who goes to the museum would not suspect that those things are there. They're not shown to the public. The average person would have no idea that they're there.
And what about, there was also something in Kentucky that harks back to about 300 million years ago. I don't think it's the same as what we talked about earlier. Wasn't it human footprints they found?
Yes. There was a scientist working in Kentucky in the 1930s and 1940s who reported the existence of human footprints in sedimentary formations about 300 million years old in Kentucky. Now, some of the skeptics said, well, these must have been carved into the rock somehow. But he did detailed studies, and he showed that, he did microphotographic studies that examined the grains of sand in this rock, and it showed that there was compression. In other words, that the grains of sand at the bottom of the footprints were compressed together more than the grains of sand at the top of the sides of the footprints, which indicated they were made by pressure, not by carving into the rock. Now, one of the skeptical scientists reported in a scientific journal and said, if this is true, then we should give up our professions as scientists and all take jobs as truck drivers.
Yep, well, sometimes that might have been a good idea.
Yeah, it might have been. But yes, that's another case of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity.
And here we're looking at that 300 million year mark again, same as the two instances we talked about earlier on. Let's do the reverse of what I asked you the first time, which is what was the modern scientific view of what was happening on the Earth 300 million years ago? Now, you already answered that. Now let's look at what was happening 300 million years ago if you go back to the Kalpa or the Yuga cycles.
Well, according to the Vedic cosmology, the Kalpa is divided into subcycles called Manvantar periods. And according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we are now in the middle of the 7th Manvantar period of the current Kalpa, which began about 2 billion years ago. So, according to the Vedic cosmology, after each Manvantar, there is a devastation after which the Earth has to be repopulated. So, that would mean if we're in the 7th Manvantar now, then that means there have been 6 devastations spaced at intervals of about 300 million years in the current Kalpa or day of Brahma. Now it's interesting that according to modern paleontology, there have been 6 major extinction events in the history of life on Earth, spaced at intervals of several hundred million years, the last one being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So
interesting.
The 300 million years ago would be in the middle of the 6th Manvantar period, according to the Vedic cosmological calendar. And according to the Puranas, the Vedic historical text, there were humans existing on Earth during the 6th Manvantar period, and the 5th, and the 4th, and the 3rd, and the 1st.